Welcome to the Weekly Roar, coming live from the Lion's Den, helping new managers become great leaders and awesome bosses. And now, here's your host, Greg Storch.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Lion's Den. This is the Weekly Roar. Today, we're going to continue the recap of our next two leadership lessons. During this leadership lessons mini-series, I'm sharing the recap of two lessons learned each week from my last series, Lessons Learned in Leadership. Since the series started well over 6 months ago, I wanted to go back over those lessons in a Reader's Digest fashion and bring back the highlights for you to keep those lessons fresh in your mind. So this week, we're rewinding the clock again and going back to December 2020. And we're talking about lessons 11 and 12. Now, before we jump into all that, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Greg Storch. I'm the owner of Lion Enterprise, host of the Weekly Roar, and the founder of a worldwide bartered coaching program called The Helping Hand. I'm a certified professional leadership coach and a certified leadership speaker and trainer. And as a friendly reminder, you can find all of my video resources on my website at lion-enterprise.com. Just look for the Lion's Pride Library and check them all out. Okay, let's start with the recap of lesson 11. And I called that one, Keeping the Main Thing, the Main Thing. During this lesson, I reintroduced the Pareto Principle. I had spoken previously about that principle in other lessons. It's the one that's also known as the 80-20 rule. Ironically, it was named after an Italian economist, Vilfredo Pareto, who first noticed the idea as it related to land ownership in Italy. He noted that 80% of the land back in the late 1800s was owned by 20% of the people. Now, basically, the Pareto Principle states that for many outcomes, roughly 80% of the consequences come from 20% of the causes. Now, my favorite name for that concept is the law of the vital few. The reason I shared that principle during this lesson was because of the positive impact it had on me by helping me to focus my attention in the right areas as a leader. It's a time saver and a game changer, being able to approach things with the understanding of the law of the vital few. During the lesson, I also mentioned the KISS principle. Everybody knows the acronym KISS, right? There are tons of variations on it. And in the Navy, I was told it stood for keep it simple, stupid. The reason for mentioning KISS was because when things remain simple and focused, we become more effective and we produce better results versus trying to do a lot of things and just being stretched thin. Simplicity is a key factor in our ability to be successful. Now, it was during that week's lesson that I shared 5 decisions that will help you make the shift from being a doer of many things to a leader of few things. It was intended to help those who struggle with the focus and have a million things on their plate. The things that add to confusion about which things need to get done and which things can wait. Now, here are those 5 decision points once again. First, you have to decide to stop being a know-it-all. Successful leaders know when they don't have all the answers, and they're smart enough to know who to go to for the things they don't know. As I matured in my leadership roles, I learned that I didn't have to always have the answers, but my greatest strength was knowing who to ask or where to go for the answers. When it comes to leadership, it's better to know the most important things than to know everything. I shared an example of the law of the vital few by telling the story of my time serving as the medical planner with the Marine Corps during Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. In that role, I was responsible for briefing the combat commander on all medical logistic matters. There was just no way that commander could have planned everything on his own. He had to have others around him to augment the things he didn't know. I had to learn how to sift through the information and grasp the most important details. What helped me to do that was remembering that only 20% of the medical information I was receiving was going to give him 80% of what he needed to know to make good decisions when it came to medical support during the war. So the lesson there was about the importance for leaders to surround themselves with the people who can help them fill in the gaps. Having the right people in place helps to keep the main thing the main thing. Now, the second decision was to stop believing that you have to be the first to know everything. Look, nobody likes being out of the loop. And when it comes to leadership, it can lead to getting blindsided. But when leaders immerse themselves too far in the details, it serves as a distraction and it can cause them to lose perspective. This is why I encourage leaders to foster a belief that they just don't have to be the first to know everything. I shared that one of the most important things a leader can do is create an environment where subordinate leaders feel comfortable and confident to make decisions at their level. Not everything has to be escalated for a decision by the CEO. For leaders, it's better to know the most important things than to know everything. Trust your people to address the things they can and to know what needs to be escalated so you can keep the main thing the main thing. Now, the third decision was one that didn't come too easy for people because it required trust in others. And that was to make the decision to allow others to represent you. Now, I talked about the bag of worms that doing something like that could open up, and it's why some leaders have trouble doing it. See, when leaders delegate their authority to other leaders, the potential to be misrepresented exists, and so does the potential for their actions to negatively impact the leader's reputation. This decision requires that trust be built first, but once we have it, it frees us up to remain focused on the main things that really matter the most. I shared the story during this lesson about Phyllis, my assistant when I was the senior program manager in Washington, D.C. Phyllis and I shared an office, and I pulled her into many of the details of my job, including the finances. Now, when I made financial decisions on the contract, I spent time explaining my decisions to her. The reason I did that was because that's how she was able to get to know my heart and my mind. When the time came for her to make a financial decision on my behalf, she made that decision, and it was the same one I would have made. That's when I knew it was time to delegate my authority to her without the risk. When leaders can make the decision to allow others to represent them, to delegate their authority, it helps them to keep the main thing the main thing. Now, the fourth decision that leaders have to make is to focus on their strengths. To be a good leader, you absolutely have to know your strengths and your weaknesses. You not only have to know who you are, but also who you're not. Successful leaders know they can't be everything to everyone. They say that half of being smart is knowing what you're dumb at. Operating in our strength zone helps us stay focused on the main thing. In order to do that, leaders have to decide to focus on their strengths and not just on improving their weaknesses. When we focus on our strengths and operate from our strength zone, that's a key factor in helping us keep the main thing the main thing. Then the fifth and final decision I shared with you that day was to decide to take control of the things that take your time and attention away. If you manage your day by a calendar or a planner, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. It can be easy for things to take over your calendar. I like to help people, and so my calendar can fill up fast. And it takes a concentrated effort for me to really control what I allow on my calendar. But I have to remember that it's impossible for me to fulfill my own purpose when I spend all my time fulfilling everyone else's. I shared that if you want to gain control of your daily routine, then simply ask yourself not whether your calendar will be full, but who you will allow to fill it. There are only so many hours in the day, and we have to control that commodity carefully. Think of it this way. If you don't control your time, if you aren't intentional about your calendar and you take charge of it, then others will take charge of you, and you won't want to give up that control. When we take control of our calendars, it helps us start focusing on doing the things that we should be doing to give us the greatest return and reward. So those were the 5 decisions that I shared that day during this lesson learned. And to get focus and be able to keep the main thing the main thing. Remember, decide not to be a know-it-all, to be the first to know everything, to allow others to represent you, to focus on your strengths, and to decide what and who takes up your time. And we do that by taking control of our calendars. As I wrapped up the lesson that day, I shared this quote by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow that said, "In character, in manner, in style, in all things, the supreme excellence is simplicity." So that now brings us to the recap of the 12th lesson that I shared, and I called that one, "We All Make Mistakes." During that weekly roar, I mentioned a previous lesson from my effective thinking series when I spoke about realistic thinking. Realistic thinking is something that allows leaders not to just be positive about the future, but also remain grounded in the reality of the situation. And that was the main point of that lesson that dovetailed nicely into that one. This lesson learned was about being able to see not just all the great things, but also all the mistakes that are happening as well. Because when leaders place their focus on all the things that are going right and push aside those things that are going wrong, it sets them up for the blind side. When we get into a pattern of believing that everything's going well, we miss potential problems. If you're in a leadership position, remember that the biggest mistake a leader can make is not asking what mistakes they're making. This was a great lesson because it was relatable to a lot of us. Many here have matured to the point that we now understand the important role that mistakes have in our growth. That lesson reminded me of a quote by George Bernard Shaw who said, "A life spent making mistakes is not only more honorable, but more useful than a life spent doing nothing." We don't need to spend our time learning how not to fail. We all make mistakes, but the thing is avoiding repeating the same ones. Every time we make the same mistake, the price goes up. For leaders, not only does the price go up, but confidence in our ability to lead goes down. And that brought me to share 5 things we can start doing to learn how to fail successfully. The first thing I said we had to do in order to fail successfully is to acknowledge our own mistakes and weaknesses. It's pretty common for leaders to believe they have to be perfect or people won't want to follow them. They try to hide their weaknesses and their mistakes. But what I've learned is that when leaders act like they're perfect, it actually makes them unrelatable. Nobody can relate to perfection because they aren't perfect. This is one way to make yourself relatable as a leader. Acknowledge your mistakes and allow your followers to see that you're not perfect. When we can admit our weaknesses and front up to our mistakes, it doesn't come as a surprise to our followers. It actually serves as a reassurance to them. Taking a realistic look at yourself and admitting to your weaknesses is the first step in anticipating mistakes and learning from the ones we do make. The second thing I said we had to do if we wanted to fail successfully is to understand that mistakes are the price of progress. You know, in the National Football League, whether a team wins or loses, they all find themselves in a room the following week reviewing the tapes of the game. They aren't just looking at what worked. They're also looking at their mistakes so they can learn from them and not repeat them. But we don't have to be professional football players to understand the power of learning from our mistakes. The key is to confront them and not take them personally. If you want to reach your potential as a leader, expect to make mistakes and fail. Now, the third thing I said we have to do in order to fail successfully is to learn from our mistakes. I think it was Julius Caesar who was attributed with the earliest version of the saying that experience is the best teacher. But my mentor, John C. Maxwell, made a great point that experience isn't the best teacher, evaluated experience is. What he meant by that is that if we don't take the time to go back and review our mistakes, we'll fail to take the lesson away from it. It's not the act of going through the mistake that gives us the experience. It's going back and grabbing the lesson from it that helps us to grow and improve. So remember this, just like in the field of science, mistakes always come before the discovery of truth. And this is why it's important that we take time to evaluate our experiences, good and bad, so we can learn the lesson given in the experience. The fourth thing I said that day that we have to do in order to fail successfully is to ask, what am I missing? It's easy to make decisions based on the things that we know, but the fact is that there's plenty we don't know. We can set a direction based on what we see, but what about the things we don't see? Those are the things that tend to blindside us. Now, one of the best ways to navigate the things we don't know or the things that we don't see is to rely on others and ask the question, what am I missing? Ask that question and it grabs people's attention, forcing them to take pause and think. When we do that, it helps us to skip over the obvious things and start seeing the not so obvious things. It helps us to think more realistically and avoid assuming that everything's perfect. If we don't ask the question and force others and ourselves to stop and think into it, we avoid making decisions based on assumptions and the false pretense that everything is perfect. And then that brought me to the fifth and final thing that you have to do in order to fail successfully. And that was to give permission to push back. It's one thing to surround ourselves with other leaders who could help us see things that are in our blind spots, but we also have to create a culture where they feel comfortable challenging us and speaking up. One of the worst things a leader can do is quiet the voices of those they lead by creating a culture where they don't feel like they have a voice. During that lesson, I urged others not to become leaders who avoid bad news, but rather a leader who invites it. Leaders can do that by giving permission to those closest to them to ask the hard questions and give their opinions when they may not agree with what the leader's doing. If you're leading people, then be sure you give them your permission to ask hard questions and push back on your ideas when it's needed. And that's a permission that has to be given to them by you. And you want to make sure that this is happening on the front end instead of the back end. Because if everything's quiet when decisions are being considered, it's not going to be very quiet once they all play out. Now, we can avoid that by simply asking one thing: what mistake am I making? So those were the 5 things I said we must do to fail successfully. First, admit your own mistakes and weaknesses. Everything always begins with us first. Second, accept the fact that mistakes are the price tag of success. You're going to have to make mistakes if you expect to move forward successfully. Third, learn from your mistakes. Evaluate your failures and mistakes so you can learn from them and avoid repeating them in the future. Fourth, be willing to ask the golden question: what are we missing? The more minds you have working towards success, the greater the chances are you'll find it. And the fifth thing is, don't forget to give your people permission to push back up front, creating a culture where people feel safe in challenging the leader to avoid making mistakes. There's one thing I know that's certain, and not many things are, but when it comes to making mistakes, I can guarantee that all of us have, and we will continue to make them. It's all part of the human experience. But what isn't certain is what happens because of the mistake. It takes intentional actions to fail successfully, and those 5 things I shared during that lesson learned was designed to help others end up on the right side of a wrong decision. We all make mistakes, don't we? If you want to become a better leader, understanding this fact of life will help you do that. See, mistakes have the power to make us into something better than we were before, but we have to be willing to acknowledge and learn from our mistakes. Do that, and you'll be well on your way to failing successfully. All right, everybody, that does it for this week's recap. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to keep running to the roar, then join me next week as I continue these micro lessons in review, and I'll recap the 13th and 14th lessons learned in leadership. All you have to do is just come on back to the Lion's Den next Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Thanks, everybody, for supporting me and watching the Weekly Roar today. I appreciate you. And until we meet again next Wednesday, remember, be powerful, but stay poised, just like a lion. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for watching the Weekly Roar live event at lionenterprise.com. If you enjoyed this video, please tell others to join us each week here in the Lion's Den. Thanks again, and see you next week.